So Golden Moose asked me, when do you know your piece is finished? How do you get to that point? And how do you get over, like, the self-doubt of starting a piece? Because you don't know when it's done. So I'll start off by saying it's super hard to know when you're finished a piece. It's hard to tell if it's rendered enough. It's hard to tell if, like, you've overworked it, especially when you're starting out. Like, I know when I was starting out, I thought a lot of my pieces were finished and looked great, but looking back on them, it's like, no, this was really underworked, or this part was super overworked, and it's kind of all over the place, and what were you doing, Ursula? But with experience and with time, I've kind of learned what to expect from a finished piece and how to get there. So I think your best, test to know when a piece is finished is to have intent for your work. If you have intention behind what you're trying to convey, you'll know better when you've hit that mark. So when you're sitting down to start on a piece, really think about, what am I trying to do with this? What emotions am I trying to convey? What action am I trying to convey? If you're, say, working in comics, the intention you're definitely going for is translating the script into visuals. You'll want to make sure the characters are clearly expressing the emotions they're supposed to be expressing. Objects and backgrounds and character gestures, you want to make sure they're all rendered clearly enough that the reader can understand what's going on. With illustration, it's pretty similar, but I think you have a bit more leeway depending on how abstract you're going with your concept. Anyways, when you're sitting down before you start the piece, or when you've sketched out ideas, it's good to figure out your intent. You can also do it when you get to that place where you have it sketched out and that self-doubt hits you and you're like, where am I going and how will I know when this is done? Ask yourself some of these qualifying questions about what your intent is. So for example, how realistic do I want this to be? Do I want it to be kind of hyper-realistic, semi-cartoonish? How stylized do I want it? Do I want it super simple? How tight do I want my line work? Do I want it really loose and fluid, or do I want it really tight and refined? How rendered do I want the anatomy or the background or the object? Do I want it to be super realistic, or do I want to just suggest the form of this thing? That kind of goes back to realism versus stylized. What emotion do I want to convey? Have I successfully conveyed this emotion? Can people understand the forms that I've put down? Do they understand the action of what's going on? And sometimes when you sit down and you've hit that point where you're like, is this finished? It's good to look at it and go, if I did this over again, what would I change? So asking these questions can really solidify what you want out of your piece. Because if you go in with kind of I'm just going to go till it looks good, you don't know how rendered you want to make it. Whereas if you ask these questions of how stylized, how realistic, is it understandable, what emotions am I conveying, you'll know when you've done those things. And even then, early on, critique will really help you know when a piece is finished. So show it to your peers or your friends. Ask them how they feel about it. Don't always ask them, what they think you should do next, because they might not give you the right answer depending on, your intent. Because usually when you ask, what should I do, people will tell you, unless they're, a coach or an art teacher or a professional. Even then, professionals don't even know how to give the best advice. Anyways. Generally, don't ask people what they think you should do next, because a lot of the time people will tell you what they want out of it rather than following what you want to do with it. Unless you're talking to a coach or an art teacher, they might have a better idea of how to help you get to your intention better. But usually people will just tell you well, I would have made this more realistic, or I would have gone a more cute style. But ask them how they feel about what they're looking at. Ask them, what do you think is going on in this picture? Are they kissing? Are they hugging? What do you think is happening in this? Can you tell what you're looking at? Does that hand look right? Just gauge their emotion, gauge their feelings on the piece. That's how you gauge if you've hit the right emotional mark. So if they're oh, this piece feels so sad, and you're oh, it was supposed to feel more angry, then you need to change some things, and ask them if they know what's going on, so that if they say oh, I thought those characters were hugging and you were actually trying to draw them kissing, okay, I need to change some things. And same with if you're not sure how rendered the anatomy needs to be, you can ask about that. Just say especially if you're talking to other artists, they'll probably be able to tell you if you rendered the figure well enough. And if you need to go more or or pull back a bit, right? So compare the feedback with the intention for your work, and you'll know that you've hit the mark and you're getting these really nice finished pieces when you start getting really like stellar reviews from people. And they say like, oh, this looks great. And, get lots of opinions, because there will be people who will out the gate just say like, oh, that looks great. But you'll know when you're getting there, when people start having these great reactions to it. And like I said before, it takes a lot of time and experience to understand when your pieces are finished. When you're starting out, don't worry if your stuff is like over-rendered or under-rendered. It's gonna happen. You're learning. Just focus on getting the piece to a place where you're like happy with it. Because the best thing you can do is try to like put out finished pieces and then go back later with some like time between you and like the work and say like, is this actually finished? Yes, no, figure it out from there. Rather than trying to figure it out in the moment when you're working on it can be hard because you're really invested in the piece, you're like too close to it. Taking some time away can really help you decide whether you need to go further with it or if you need to pull back on it. If you're running into the problem where things are overworked, so like you're over-rendering things, you're going too hard on things, whatever, try forcing yourself to like stop a piece after a deadline. So say like, I only have today to work on this. That's like a really tight deadline, but I only have today, I only have the next 3 days to work on this, I only have until a certain date, whatever. And it'll teach you to put the minimum down on the paper, so you don't go over it too much. So like once you hit that deadline, you're not allowed to touch it anymore. So you want to make sure you get all the important details into it before the deadline. And if you're having the opposite problem, where you're underworking it and you're not pushing it far enough, force yourself to, once you think it's finished, keep going. Have a second round at it after a few days and some time away from it. Force yourself to look at it longer than you normally would. You'll find yourself you'll find places that say need more detail or that need some more like TLC. So forcing yourself to like keep going on it can really help you add more to it. It's okay to go back and edit your pieces. I do that a lot for my comic pages because I run into that problem where I underwork things. I don't put in as much detail as I need. You don't have to get it right the first time. So I hope that answers your question. That's all I have for today. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions or if you'd like to request a video topic, please leave a comment down below and I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye!